and its legacy, with a particular emphasis on the life and work of William Burroughs. He has recently launched an online rare book business, Third Mind Books, of which I think I've seen cards on the display table on this floor. He has hundreds of important rarities for sale. What is especially interesting, I think, is that in your website you also describe them very carefully, and you also have other articles and information on what you are selling. You will tell us more about what you are doing right now. Arthur, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good. It's an honor to be in Middelburg for this inaugural conference, and it is wonderful to have the opportunity to hear so many interesting papers and presentations on the beats. I'm an American book collector, and for the past 30 years I have been collecting books, broadsides, and ephemera of the beat movement, with a special focus on the work of William S. Burroughs. I identify with a connoisseur tradition that emphasizes object-based research. I can relate to Oliver Harris's description of, quote, the manuscript fetishist's private thrill of handling the original objects, those delicate sheets of paper bearing the imprint of typewriter keys and author's pen, end quote. I know this is unfashionable in an age in which documents can be effortlessly replicated and distributed electronically, but I think you can discover things that you otherwise wouldn't if you are up close to what is called the original manuscript. I've recently become a bookseller. The image on the screen is on the home page of Third Mind Books, which I founded and curate. This is a photograph of the main repository of my personal collection. At midlife, I decided to enter what some might consider a risky new business because the work of the beat writers and artists moved me so profoundly when I was young. And I never got over it. And now here I am, facing you scholars. On the 18th of February, 1995, I visited William S. Burroughs at his home in Lawrence, Kansas. This photograph was taken just outside his home near the end of my visit. I've written an account of the trip, which was published in several small journals and can be read on the Third Mind Books website. I was privileged to be in the presence, serene and gracious, of the secret of my fascination, to paraphrase Dr. Harris. Why Burroughs? First of all, I was intrigued by his spectral presence, a topic that Dr. Harris has explored so brilliantly. Secondly, Burroughs immersed himself in all the trash and junk, both figuratively and literally, of our civilization, and often returned with such lyrical descriptions. Here is one from Naked Lunch. Motel, 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 broken neon arabesques. Loneliness moans across the continent like foghorns over still oily water of tidal rivers. They still move me. And thirdly, I admire Burroughs' project to short-circuit control, especially in his cut-up work with Brian Geisen. This is Burroughs' U.S. Coast Guard Certificate of Service, dated October 8, 1945. It was issued as a negative and is part of a collection of personal papers and correspondence that Burroughs sold to a dealer in London in the 1960s during a lean episode in his life. I own this fascinating cache, which includes Burroughs' honorable discharge from the U.S. Army in 1942, contractual correspondence with publishers, and even a 1960 note from a pharmaceutical company which states, "We regret to inform you that we are not in a position to fulfill your order at the present time as we are completely out of stock of the product being mescaline sulfate. This is a positive image of the certificate. Notice the photograph of then 31-year-old Burroughs, stapled to the document, overlapping and to the right of which is his signature, identical to how he would sign his name thereafter, except that he fully spells out his middle name instead of just the letter S. Here is a close-up of the image of Burroughs. I have not seen this reproduced in any publication by or concerning Burroughs. One of the exhilarations of collecting is to discover that one is in possession of what might very well be the only extant copy of this image of Burroughs from a crucial early moment when the nucleus of the Beat generation was coming together. Burroughs said, "I've got millions of images, viral and replicative. However, I get to debut this image to you." This is the front cover of the dust jacket of the first edition of Naked Lunch, published by the Olympia Press in Paris in 1959. The abstract calligraphic drawings are one of a series. Burroughs applied India ink with brush to paper in the style of his great friend and collaborator, Brian Geisen. The artwork used for this cover image was probably destroyed in the production process or otherwise lost. However, 3 other of Burroughs' artworks from this period turned up among the Parisian archives of Maurice Girodius, the publisher of Olympia Press, and are now part of my personal collection. Here is one of the artworks, in the same manner with squiggly brushwork arranged in a loose grid as seen on the first edition dust jacket. They look to me like calligraphic Chinese written characters that are about to come to life, or have gone awry, or been unleashed. Here is another example from the series. And another. None of the 3 are signed or dated, but I am certain that they are the work of Burroughs' hand per letters of provenance written by the publisher's former secretary, as well as James Gerholz, among the foremost authorities on Burroughs' life and work as guardian of his estate and legacy. Mr. Gerholz was Burroughs' personal assistant and companion during the last quarter century of his life. The seller was my friend and mentor Jeffrey Weinberg of Water Row Books, and is among the most knowledgeable and reliable dealers in our rarefied niche. Here, from another small collection of handwritten manuscript items by Burroughs that I purchased, is a notice written by Burroughs to his friend the beat poet Gregory Corso, undated, but approximately from the early 1980s. It reads as follows: "Gregory, somehow ended up with your copy of my book. Fucked up. Usually I absent-mindedly abscond with better books than that. Saw Marion tonight, and she said she gave you some help. Good, because I had nothing to offer. Sorry I didn't return your calls, but was broke and not near a private phone when O called Steve and had nothing but bad news. Anyhow, I'll call or see you tomorrow a.m. Love to you and yours, Bill." The note probably has to do with a request from Corso to score some controlled substance, and we can discern in this casually tossed off missive the sly wit and darkly comic bad luck situations that make up so much of the Burroughs zeitgeist. However, I do want to point out one very interesting echo in this particular item. Here is an example of Burroughs' typical cursive handwriting, in this case a Christmas greeting to Corso, written at the end of 1983, during the same period as the note we have just seen. Notice the great difference between his typical writing and this note. It feels like another person or a different personality wrote this, and that was my first impression when I obtained this and compared it to other samples. But now look again at the calligraphic squiggles in one of the 1959 artworks. The similarity is striking in my view. For example, note the repetition of the curved brush and pen strokes in these documents. I won't go on about Burroughs' anxiety regarding the threat of invasion or possession by spirits other than his own, which he wrote about guarding against. or the automatic methods in which he created artworks. But my point here is to illustrate the importance of connoisseurship for being able to carefully examine original documents. This is the front cover of Tornado Alley, published by Cherry Valley Editions in 1989 in an edition of 4,000 copies. In 1999, I acquired the original archive of the materials that led to the publication of this work, including Burroughs' hand and typewritten manuscripts, subsequent editorial transcripts, and correspondence. I'm working on a study of this one short late work in the Burroughs oeuvre, and I'd like to describe the highlights of my research and then share some of my thoughts about Tornado Alley. Early this spring, I made a pilgrimage to Cherry Valley in upstate New York to visit Charles and Pamela Beach Plymell, the publishers of Tornado Alley. I wanted to talk to them about the experience of editing and publishing this collection of 7 short pieces by their good friend and colleague, William S. Burroughs. These remarkable people live in relative anonymity in this tiny village. They are a living link to most of the writers being discussed at this conference. In this picture, I'm standing with Charles and Pamela in front of their home. Charles Plymell is a legendary literary and cultural figure who first published Zap Comics, one of the very first and arguably the most significant of the 1960s underground comics. In addition, he has written many works of prose and poetry. In his memoirs, he recounts his relationships with Burroughs, Neil Cassidy, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac, among others. His wife, Pamela Beach Plymell, is his partner in publishing and literary friendships. She is the great niece of fabled Shakespeare and Company proprietor and publisher Sylvia Beach, and is the daughter of Mary Beach, who, along with her husband, Claude Pellew, were important writers, artists, and cultural figures who collaborated with Burroughs and many others. I was received warmly by the Plymells, and we settled into a long discussion from which I learned much about the process that led to the publication of Tornado Alley. Very briefly, I learned that Burroughs and the Plymells had a long friendship dating back to the late 1960s, and that during the mid-1980s, about a decade after they had published his Cobblestone Gardens, Burroughs very generously and casually provided them with a group of newly written routines and fragments. The editing began with Pamela's transcription of the Burroughs manuscript. Then James Grerholz, Burroughs' personal assistant and companion, seen in this photo on the right, with Burroughs and Charles Plymell in the 1980s, heavily corrected and edited the routines, adding 2 more to the 5 that Burroughs had originally sent to the Plymells. He pulled a fragment that was factually based because he felt it belonged in a memoir, which he explained in a letter to the Plymells. This letter is part of a large file of original documents that Mr. Grerholz scanned and sent to me. Between this file, my archive, and my interview with the Plymells, I think I now have all the substantive pieces to form a complete picture of the creation of Tornado Alley. I'd like to briefly focus on one of the routines. In Dead End Reeking Street, Burroughs poses the threat of a viral lethal epidemic that presents itself as a hideous plague of parasites. This is a theme that appears frequently in his one long work. Of course, it is a metaphor for the enslavement of a deceived and exploited humanity by a virus that controls its hosts. The brain-burrowing phenomenon is described in hard-boiled hallucinatory prose and over-the-top verbal imagery. Together, they create a work of challenging literary art. And now I'd like to draw your attention to a very uncoincidental Burroughsian synchronization. At the end of Book of Shadows, another routine in Tornado Alley, Burroughs paraphrases a famous epitaph by Sulla the Happy, the legendary ancient Roman dictator. Nobody ever did him a favor or an injury without being fully repaid. Here is an excerpt from Plutarch's Life of Sulla, translated by John Dryden, in which he explained what happened after Sulla's sybaritic retirement. By these courses he encouraged a disease which had begun from some unimportant cause. and for a long time he failed to observe that his bowels were ulcerated, till at length the corrupted flesh broke out into lice. Many were employed day and night on destroying them, but their work so multiplied under their hands that not only his clothes, baths, basins, but his very meat was polluted with that flux and contagion. They came swarming out in such numbers. He went frequently by day into the bath to scour and cleanse his body, but all in vain. The evil generated too rapidly and too abundantly for any ablutions to overcome it. The dead-end Reeking Street routine wonderfully illustrates the wide range of texts and experiences, from pop culture to classical literary references, that inspired Burroughs. Burroughs describes what happens to Reggie as follows. "Get out of here, it's spitting eggs and larvae," and in fact Reggie lost all human semblance as the heads and roots protruded from every inch of his body, spurting out larvae with transparent needle teeth. This is the illustration for the Burroughs text that I've just quoted from. It was drawn by S. Clay Wilson, one of the original underground comics pioneers and another transgressive genius, who was enthusiastically chosen by his friends Burroughs and the Plymels to contribute to this work. The two characters pictured here, who encountered Reggie in dead-end Reeking Street, are able to rid themselves of the bursting horror by bathing in kerosene. They were luckier than Sula. Then the routine moves into something that is most interesting. They prepare to confront the origin of the plague with the complete works of Shakespeare, a book which is described as possessing implosive telepathic properties. Usually Burroughs presents words as viruses, but in this case the works of Shakespeare are an antidote to disease. Here are the original manuscript pages of Dead-End Reeking Street. The first page, typed by Burroughs, contains his hand corrections. You can see that for every correction, there are many misspellings that he did not catch. Pamela Beach Plymel told me that Burroughs was a terrible typist. Here is the evidence. All of the errors were corrected by the editors while honoring the purely Burroughsian essence of the prose. The editors, especially James Greyholz, were obviously very experienced at translating Burroughs' prose into publishable form. The next page continues the typed text with a few corrections in Burroughs' hand. At the bottom begins an entirely cursive handwritten portion that continues on the other side of the same sheet. Notice that the spelling and coherence of the writing is greatly improved when Burroughs writes by hand. Here on the left is the final handwritten page of Dead-End Reeking Street that we have just seen next to the last page of the story as published. They are virtually identical in content. The routine ends with 3 numbered dream fragments, almost certainly from his own dreams, which he frequently drew on in his books, particularly in My Education, a Book of Dreams. This shift from hard-boiled, noir-infused mayhem, a fantasy of a grotesque psychophysical plague, to a serene, enigmatic coda, overshadowed with menace, is quintessentially Burroughsian. This has been a very superficial overview of one of the projects I'm currently working on. I appreciate you generously allowing me to share these artifacts and my ideas about them with you. At the back of the room are copies of our first Third Mind Books catalog, which we've just published. And later on, please take a copy with my compliments. Thank you.